This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 21st of, May 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks. I'm the adorable creature in the screen inset.
I'm Michael Wade.
Hi. How you doing? Looks like your volume is down a little bit. Let me pop you up there. Hi, Michael. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's start off with something that we texted about briefly, which I'm not sure that we disagree on this, but I wanted to talk about it before we got into some.
No, I think I'm glad you started with this because I think it's a good conversation.
But I wanted to talk about the debt ceiling limit and the president's, well, I don't know if it's the president's thread. It's certainly Democrats in the Senate who have been urging the president to issue new debt using the 14th Amendment as a excuse to do so. So let's actually look at what Section 4 of the 14th Amendment actually says, and I should have brought it up on the screen, and I don't. So I'll just do the best I can from memory, which is the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, and then there's a bunch of stuff about rebellion and stuff, shall not be questioned. So it's the public debt, the validity of the public debt of the United States, authorized by law, ... shall not be questioned. So the Democrat argument is that since we can't really question the public debt, and since Congress has authorized this spending, and since, by the way, the president by law cannot not spend what Congress says they have to spend, that money has to be spent even if there is not enough revenue to cover it, and debt has to be issued. That is the argument in a nutshell. Let me expand on it a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to you for what I'm sure will be a rebuttal. So here is the state of the law as far as the budget goes. There is a debt ceiling law that says the United States cannot issue an amount of debt over X amount. And that X amount is whatever Congress says it is, and they have routinely increased it over and over and over again over the last, several decades. So, Law 1, no new debt over and above X amount. Law 2, which Congress imposed after Richard Nixon tried to implement rescission on certain budget items, is that the president must spend the money Congress authorizes. If Congress authorizes it by law, the president cannot go through and say, no, I'm not going to spend that, I'm not going to spend that. The president is bound to spend that money.
There's no line item veto, correct?
Yeah, there is no line item veto for budget items at all. So
and Clinton tried to do that as well.
Yeah, and how well did that work out? It didn't. Right. So the president has the responsibility to implement the spending that Congress says. And if Congress, and the idea being behind this, if Congress says, I want you to spend $5 trillion. I want you to spend $5 trillion this year. The president has to spend that $5 trillion. That's just the law. The president cannot say, nope, can't do that because it would break the debt limit. So I can't spend that money because the president doesn't have that power. Congress has now ordered the president to spend the money. Congress has plenary power over what money gets appropriated. If Congress, via their action, appropriates an amount of money that would require borrowing over and above the debt limit that Congress itself has set, then Congress has, in effect, overturned its own debt limit by appropriating money that is not available via revenue, and that money has to be spent. Therefore, the president has to spend that money. That is the argument, I think, and that's as fair a rendition of the argument as I can make.
I think that's more than fair, but yeah. Well, the first problem is that the debt is not the entire budget. And in other words, we could pay off just debt and not have to, and no other appropriations, and not have to raise the debt ceiling. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that the 14th Amendment, Section 4, does not authorize anybody, well, and really Section 5, which is where the authorization comes in. There's no authorization to the executive there anywhere. The only authorization is to Congress through appropriate legislation or regulation to enforce the 14th Amendment. There's nothing there for the executive to do. And in fact, in Article 2, there's no possibility for the executive to unilaterally raise funds. It's not a power that it has. So this would be absolutely extra constitutional. And the third big problem when it comes to a case by case basis is that in this case there is a bill that the appropriator in general, which is the House of Representatives, has passed a law that raises the debt ceiling and provides for spending cuts and controlling spending. I mean, who's questioning the validity of the debt? There is nobody. There's nobody questioning the validity of the debt. And that's not even going into the actual historical nature of the 14th Amendment and why that section was put in there.
Yeah. So just as a matter of constitutional interpretation, that section basically says all of the Confederate States of America's debt is null and void. The United States of America's debt is good to go. But all of you Confederates and all the Confederate bounties and any debt that the Confederate States of America borrowed, if you paid for one of their bonds, well, you're screwed.
Right. And the only remedy enacted therein is to either prevent or remove a congressman who denies that, or somebody in an office of public trust, but not the president. An elector of the president or the vice president, sure. But that's not the case here. There is literally nobody denying the validity of the debt. There's simply they have a different budget priority as to how to pay for the debt and the other appropriations that Congress solely has the power to create. So I don't find this argument at all persuasive. I mean, this kind of goes back to that whole, $1 trillion coin bullshit.
Yeah, I don't think the Supreme Court would find it persuasive either.
No, I don't think they would. Matter of fact, I don't think anybody on that court would find it very persuasive, especially with the attacks on the Supreme Court that are coming from the political branches. I think that they would be perfectly happy to hold everybody to their constitutional obligations, just as a way to say, fuck you, back off, get in your lane, leave us alone, leave the legislature alone. Let's all do what we're actually constitutionally empowered to do.
But I guess the question then arises is, what does the president do when he has to spend money that Congress has appropriated that says you must spend this, and there's no money to spend it? What is the responsibility of the executive in a case where Congress has said you have to spend $5 trillion this year, and the executive says, well, there's only $3.5 trillion in revenue. That leaves us with $1.5 trillion shortfall. I don't have the money, and you won't let me.
But that's not where we're at. I mean, revenue. What was the last revenue for this last tax year? Or at least up until the last
it was $2 trillion less than we took in than we spent.
Right. So that's around $4 trillion, right?
Right. So we're taking in $4 trillion, but we're running a $6 trillion budget.
Exactly. So that extra $2 trillion isn't needed to go towards the debt. Matter of fact, if you really want to get into it, the Treasury.
But Congress said you can't spend it on the debt. Congress said it has to be spent on, unicorns and butterflies, and you have to.
No, Congress hasn't said that. That's the thing. Congress has not said you have to spend that on butterflies and unicorns.
Well, if that's what it says in the budget,
There
or
was
at
a
least
continuing
in
resolution.
the continuing resolution, then that's what you have
Right.
to spend it on. But of course, there is no budget. There hasn't been a budget for a decade.
That's right. So, no, that's not Congress. That's simply saying, hey, look, we'll kick the can down the road a little further. And those aren't necessarily debts. Debts are actually enforceable debts. So, for example, Social Security payments, Medicare payments are not enforceable debts. You can't sue the government and force them to pay for you. That it's not possible. First of all, the American government has sovereign immunity. Second of all, it's really just a promise from Congress. And third of all, they already spent that money like ages ago. So
Yeah, that
it's-
money was gone.
it's a false
32
promise.
That money was gone $32 trillion ago.
Yeah, exactly. So what the Treasury implicitly has as an actual power and duty is to prioritize its payments. So it can absolutely prioritize payments on Treasury on T-bills. Although it's interesting that I think fully half, if not more than half, of the payments that are due on debt would go to the Fed. So
Yeah, well, there is
that's
that
the big puzzle we've been talking about for a long time.
because the Fed is holding $5 trillion
Right.
of debt.
So, I mean, is that really a priority? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Fed destroys itself if it calls it in. So it's like,
Well, here's the one real problem that I have with this argument. Let's say the president goes ahead and asserts that he has the power under the 14th Amendment implicitly to increase the debt so that he can spend what Congress has appropriated or what Congress said to spend in the continuing resolution, which is, by the way, the same continuing resolution we've been using for 10 years. Let's say he does that. Here is where it gets really interesting. Now the Treasury is going to have a bond auction.
mm-hmm.
And they're going to have to tell the potential bondholders straight up, the president is having us do this. The legal authority for this is not yet been adjudicated. So these may or may not be valid bonds.
Right.
So what kind of interest rate do we have to pay you to take on a bond that the Supreme Court in another, 6 months will declare facially invalid?
Right. 50 cents on the dollar, 40 cents on the dollar.
I see. This is the problem with the argument, and I hope somebody at the Biden administration realizes this. You can't just tritty-trot into the primary bond market and say, "Hey, I've got all these bonds. I'm going to sell them. I don't care what Congress says. Here you go. Here's $1 trillion in bonds. You fellows bid on them." I don't see that bond auction going well.
I mean, I suppose you could order the Treasury to just print bills and greenmail the whole thing, but
Well,
that
the
sort of action does even more to undermine the dollar than this iffy 14th Amendment thing.
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing. Joe Biden has indicated, at least news reports say, if you trust news reports, which, by the way, we are going to discuss a bit later, because I have that Harris-Harvard poll. Woof. Boy, what the political class in this country believes and what the people of this country believe are two entirely different things, but we'll get into that in a minute. The thing is, there is always the option, and what we've been told from some reports, the insiders say that Joe Biden is not going to invoke any sort of 14th Amendment thing. And really, he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to try to provoke a constitutional crisis. He can just have the Treasury, like the old Saturday night cartoon from 1970, 77, 78. I can just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, this is Jimmy. Why don't you roll out a couple of rolls of them C notes?" I mean, he could conceivably, embrace the modern monetary theory solution and just say, "Hey, just print the money and we'll pay everybody in cash."
Right. I mean, the Weimar Republic did that. It worked out great for them.
Yeah, that's exactly how they paid their World War One reparations payments. They just
Where you
printed
had to
it.
get paid like 2, 3 times a day. Just
Yeah, they just printed it out and sent it off to France and said, "Oh, you want 1 billion Reichsmarks? Here you go. Enjoy."
we just sent you whole rolls of toilet paper.
Yeah, pretty much. But I mean, that is the that is one thing he could do without having to provoke a constitutional crisis over the 15th or the 14th Amendment. And by the way, any such bond auction like that would throw the entire bond market in turmoil.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not just the bond market. It's also going to throw. We're already in a little bit of a banking crisis here. It's going to absolutely upturn banks. You think banks are failing right now? You have failed bond auction, or to the extent it's not considered failed, you have a bond auction where the yields are, above 10%, which they would be way above
Yeah,
10%.
look, that would be a failed bond auction.
Right.
I mean, let's
So
I mean,
those other
even if
bonds you were holding are now almost worthless. That's going to sink um, pretty much every bank in the world that holds U.S. bonds as its capital in order to finance itself.
well, look at here's the thing, and this is what most people don't understand because we are a financially illiterate country, as I was talking to my wife
We're not
about
the only country.
earlier today. Yeah, we're not the only country. It's not the fact that the bond auction itself would fail and end
Right.
up with, a 12% 10-year auction, right? I'm demanding 12%, and I can't imagine that they would be satisfied with 12% on a legally dubious bond. They would want probably a much higher risk premium than that. The
I
problem
would think.
is now that I have this tranche of bonds out there, and let's just say 10%, although we could say any figure, but let's say it's 10%. That means instantly every other bond in the secondary market, every single one, we have now set what the expected yield is for U.S. Treasury bonds because we now have a Treasury auction that demanded 10%. So 4.5%, 5, 6%, whatever it happens to be hovering about now, that's gone overnight, which means that every time I sell a bond, I have to reduce the price because I have to ensure that the coupon payment they're going to get is the equivalent of a 10% yield on that bond.
Right.
So all of my holdings in bonds, which let's say I valued at, when I bought them from the Treasury at 2.5%,
Mm-hmm.
and I bought, $10,000 at 2.5%, I'm not going to be able to sell them at $10,000. I have now quadrupled the interest rate. So I am going to have to sell those things for like 8 grand to get a 10% yield off of those bad boys, which means I'm losing $2,000. Well, I'm losing 20% of the value of that bond. That's 20%
Right.
of value that just gets erased overnight. And the trouble is, of course, those bonds are my assets. And
They're the reason that you can stay liquid
exactly.
and also bring in investors. I mean, this is exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. They got into a crunch because of the interest rates. They had to start selling off assets, which included T-bills, and those T-bills were worth a lot less on the open market
So they
than
take a
when they
loss
first bought
on
them
every sell.
every single time. So they didn't recoup what they already had. Then their liquidity and their value dropped precipitously, and
Yeah, that's a
they just got into a death spiral.
that's a perfect test of the proposition. We lose money on every sale, but we make it up in volume. No, that's not exactly how that works. So this is just a suggestion. And look, a lot of congressmen like John Fetterman, or at least the person who tweets for John Fetterman, said, well, this is exactly what the 14th Amendment is for. Now, it's not exactly what the 14th Amendment is for, but
It's got nothing to do with what the 14th Amendment is for.
I think they are creating a colorable argument that they could take to the Supreme Court. Would it convince Sonia Sotomayor? Maybe. Will it?
I'm not even sure it gets past the circuit court level, to be quite honest. I don't even think the Ninth Circuit would buy this rather stupid argument. Um, I, maybe if they're lucky, maybe they find a Hawaii judge who puts it in such an eloquent way that the Ninth Circuit's like, yeah, let's go with it.
Well, I think I've stated it about as
You gave it a
succinctly.
very, very positive spin, quite frankly.
I think I've stated it as succinctly and as positively as it could be made.
It's just there's just so many things lacking. There is no power conferred to the executive in the 14th Amendment. None. Except inferentially, if Congress creates a law for the executive to enforce. And Congress has created no law for the executive to enforce here. Now, I guess if you wanted to get really creative, you could say, well, that continuing appropriation is a law that they created, and we're simply enforcing that law. Okay, I can see the argument there, but that only gets you so far. When Congress is right now telling you, okay, here's the new law, and you're saying, no, we want to go with the old law.
Well, the trouble is Congress isn't telling him that. The House is.
The House is. That's right. The Senate is not
The Senate
stepping
is
up
not.
to the plate.
So the
But
president doesn't have
the
anything
Senate
other than
also
the
does not.
existing continuing resolution in front of him.
Well, and the Senate doesn't have the power to create appropriations.
No, just the
So,
power to approve them or to agree to them.
so my best guess, if they pull this nonsensical thing, is once it gets to the Supreme Court, which I would think would be fairly expedited. Um, the Supreme Court would say this is a non-justiciable issue. This is a major question. Y'all need to fight about it amongst yourself. We see no powers here that are being assumed, and this is simply a question for the voters, which I think is the least heavy-handed way for the Supreme Court to deal with it. Um, y'all need to fight this amongst yourselves. That's and I think that's right. I mean, this is a political question. This is not a legal question. There is no legal authority for the executive to start raising its own funds. Period.
Well, I expect the Supreme Court would say at least that the president doesn't have this authority, but you're kicking it back to Congress and saying, you guys have to work
Exactly.
this out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the U.S. defaults, the U.S. defaults.
We've done it before.
Look, honestly, if you want to count, real, actual defaults, the U.S. defaults all the time.
That's true.
It honestly does. So, all this talk about, what has never happened before is the U.S. just saying we're not going to pay interest payments on any bonds,
Right.
which I can't imagine, even if, and this is the thing, even if we went over and above the debt limit, I can't imagine, well, not go above the debt limit, but if we run out of spending money, I can't imagine that we wouldn't first pay off the interest on the bonds, because the Treasury plays all kinds of little games with bonds that are actually technical defaults against bonds, and we just kind of elide past it, because what they never do is just send you a letter saying, hey, we're not sending you your coupon payment this quarter.
Right.
And so
Hey,
as
we're
long
gonna
as
be a little late.
so as long as those coupon payments go out, then I guess that's the only thing that we're going to consider a default on this. So now, of course, the bad
Well, and then the
of course the
problem is
bad
when-
side is that our service on the debt has increased so much that it
Right.
has now
the
matched.
interest rates rising,
Yeah, it
and then we're going to have old bonds that we're going to have to swap out for new bonds.
yeah, and our
That's gonna get tricky.
current debt service is basically equal now to our defense spending.
Yeah, so that's what almost 800
Yeah.
billion.
Yeah, it is. It has climbed over the past 10 years from 169 billion, which was kind of affordable whenever interest rates are low. So thanks to the collapse of 2008, interest rates have been low. So our service on the national debt has been minimal, and of course we have added 50% to our national debt over the last decade. So Well, and with rising interest rates, we're now at 800 billion. And if they keep rising, we're going to be well above a trillion just on
If
service on the national debt, which I expect will happen in the not too distant future. Um, at some point, something has got to give. We cannot keep spending 6 trillion a year and taking in 4 trillion a year in revenue.
well,
No.
and that's the other thing too. What annoys me the most is, well, if we don't raise the debt limit, then we're going to have to default on our obligation. No,
Or you
there's
could,
new appropriations that you're paying for that you don't have to pay for. You can prioritize our past obligations and not pay for another round of Head Start that won't work, for Jewish gay wedding, uh, pictures in freaking uh, the Sudan.
well, see, and that's the fundamental issue right now. I mean, the entire argument is revolving around we have to be able to increase spending. I mean, ultimately, that's the Democrats' argument. We
Right.
have to increase spending. And I guess we have to do that forever. But that's unsustainable. It can't be done. At some point, you have so much debt that you have to pay it off. And you can't buy a new car and a nice hat or whatever it is, $75 cigars. You have to begin budgeting and you have to begin paying off that debt, which, by the way, for the first 200 years of this country's history is exactly what we did.
That's right.
We would go into, massive debt, whether it was a Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican American War, the Civil War, and then we spent the next 20 years paying that debt back. And so,
Andrew Mellon, under Calvin Coolidge, his Secretary of Treasury, wrote a great book about that. And it's a little dry, obviously, but it's quite astute in saying it is actually unconscionable to take on these debts with no vision as how to pay for them. And the longer you let it go on, the more amoral this becomes. Now, he put it in his 1920s, but he also explained exactly how to do it. And it's actually a really brilliant book. I don't think anybody's looked at it in a really long time, unfortunately. It's sort of an outdated principle now to pay for what you need as you go. I think there's absolutely, World War II was absolutely, we needed to go into debt in order to solve that issue. That was a worldwide issue. We were completely ensconced in it, and we needed to be. And, we ended up being a big part of the solution.
but
Immediately after that, we cut our budget by what? It was like 50% or something.
yeah, we have never in peacetime had such a long sustained increase in debt with not only no plan on how to pay it back, but no plan to stop increasing that debt.
Right.
And this is just,
Hey, modern monetary theory for the win.
yeah, this is just unsustainable. And we keep issuing debt that at this point, there's no way that we are going to pay this $32 trillion of our national debt back, along with the 125-ish, let's say dead even, 100 trillion that we're going to have to pay out in Social Security over the next 40 years. It's not going to happen. Something is going to give somewhere, and the amount of money that we need just
Well, maybe
doesn't
Obamacare
exist.
will kill some of those boomers.
Yeah, well,
Let's stop collecting at some point.
yeah, it's just this whole thing is really amazing because the one thing that you can't do in Washington is cut spending. I mean, in the modern, I mean, we used to be able to do it right up until the 1950s. That shift that occurred between the 1960s and 1980s has created a culture in Washington that's now made it impossible to cut spending. And I mean real cuts in spending. We just can't do that anymore. Indeed, the entire idea of current services baseline budgeting
Right.
is that
Yeah, so a cut is not actually raising the spending in order to match, whatever, interest or
Yeah, a cut is defined as a reduction in the rate of increase
right,
in spending, not an absolute reduction in
in the
spending.
actual spending. Yeah. And indeed, that's what this bill does. This bill holds the line at 2022 spending and seeks cuts in certain extraneous spending while still raising the debt limit to allow for discretionary spending. I mean, I looked through the bill. It's really not harsh at all. It's pretty, sensical. It doesn't seem outlandish. I mean, would I like it to cut more? Oh, hell yeah. But as far as like a compromise bill, I mean, this is very well in the ballpark. I could see some, give and take that could happen, but the Biden side just won't negotiate at all. They really think they're going to get away with blaming the Republicans for this when they put forth no plan, and the Republicans have at least passed a bill in the House that raises the debt ceiling and gives them a lot of what they want in return for some things that the Republicans want.
Yeah, well, it is, and we go through this kabuki every single time, and the arguments have not changed the past four
No.
or five times we've gone through this. It's super frustrating, and if you have hope that someone in Washington D.C. is going to come to their fiscal sense, because look, the Republican idea will hold spending at 2022 levels. Okay, that's
Which
far too
were
high.
absolutely raised, right? I mean, those were still 2 trillion over what it should be.
Yeah, so I don't know how this thing is going to go, but I have to assume that at some point the Democrats have to blink, or we are literally going to default on the debt. We are just going to miss our interest payments on the debt,
Okay.
which, by the way, we don't have to do. The president can just say any money that we have has to go to that first.
Actually, the Treasury can say that without even authority from the president.
Whether they will, open question.
Yeah. Maybe not that open, but
But I mean, just going to have to watch us ride this puppy down in flames because
so what is it? June 1st is the target date?
I think so. So we'll see
Yeah,
how
we'll
that
see.
goes. But this whole thing about the 14th Amendment, interesting legal argument. Just don't think it'll fly, even with giving it the best possible cast that I can to make a colorable argument. I just don't see how it flies.
Yeah, I don't either.
In any event, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and this, by the way, sort of intersects with what we were just talking about, is the most recent Harvard CAPS Harris poll that came out. And there's a lot of stuff in here that will not be a surprise. We'll have to go through it because it is several slides, and I don't remember where everything is, but there were a couple of points that I wanted to bring out because the dichotomy between what our political and media class believes and
Yeah.
what the American people believe could not
It
be
stands in
starker
stark contrast.
in some of these things. So let's switch over to screen share here, and let's just take a look at it. Like I said, most of this stuff we can just elide past fairly very quickly. 31%
You
of
take people through that. I'll be right back. 2 seconds.
Okay, 31% of the country says that the country is on the right track. Now, this is a poll of a couple of thousand registered voters taken by Harris. They say that they are properly weighted. You can take that with as much grain of salt as you want in terms of accurately reflecting what the electorate believes. However, 31% thinks the country is on the right track. 60% think the country is on the wrong track. Economically, 29% say the U.S. economy is on the right track. 62% say it is on the wrong track. 62% think the economy is weak, with only 1/3 saying it is strong. And half of the electorate says that their personal financial situation is worsening. Do we think we're going to avoid a recession? Nope. We're being told the economy is fine, everything is fine, the banking sector is fine. we can all relax. We're not going to have a recession, but only 21% of the electorate actually believes that. Meanwhile, the number of voters, the 60% who believe that Joe Biden is doing a horrible job, is remaining steady. If you look at the red shaded areas since, well, it's been fairly steady since last June. He does get good marks. The only thing in which a majority of the voters think that Joe Biden has done a good job, strongly or somewhat approve, is in reacting to coronavirus. Right there. Everybody thinks more than half the people think he's done a good job with that. GOP approval down to 47%, which you would think, hey, great news for the Democrats, except their approval has dropped to 47% as well. Actually risen to 47% because it was down to 44%. So they're just basically equal. Do we approve Congress? 36% approves, the rest disapprove.
Can we just say something about that last chart? Is that, yeah, this happens a lot. I mean, you can see the numbers there. But when these same voters are asked, do you approve of your congressman or your senator? They're always like, oh, yeah, 90% love them.
Yeah, my Congress is fine. It's the other 434 assholes that have ruined it for everybody. Yeah, I know that. And that's been steady, by the way, for a couple
that's right.
of decades.
That's almost always how it works.
As well. Interesting snapshot here. I don't know that it has any great significance, but Trump, Musk, and DeSantis are the most favored political figures across all voters. Yeah, I don't know how Elon Musk got in there, but his net favorable is 47%. 33% hate him, which gives us a nice gap of 14%. So he has a very positive gap. Donald Trump, very polarizing. 46 love him, 47 hate him.
He's the Republican Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. So, and then you have the similar figures for everybody else, which I don't really care much about. Amazon, Google, and the U.S. military, not exactly in that order, the most favorable U.S. institutions.
That shocks me.
Yeah, Amazon and Google. I guess if you
who put together this?
Yeah, I don't get it. On the other hand, Russia.
Facebook? Are you kidding?
Russia is only slightly less unpopular than Antifa. When it comes to those who hold, and both of them are only slightly less popular than China. Among the electorate. Don't worry, we're getting to the thing that we're going to start talking about. All right, so here we go. This is the first of what people are concerned about. And the political class seems not to be as concerned about. The top three: price increases and inflation, immigration, and jobs. Those are the three things that people care most about.
And they're all directly related.
And they are all directly related. They are all economic concerns, all related to the fact that people are not confident about the economy. Difficult to see how a talk of default helps improve people's fears about price increases, inflation. Now, immigration, that's a little bit
different.
People
don't always see it as an economic, well, especially when it's expressed as immigration and not illegal immigration. And so people don't always connect the dots, although the people in Southside Chicago surely connected the dots recently, and in Brooklyn.
Yeah, because the fact is, if you're worried about working class incomes, unrestricted illegal immigration, which is largely what we have, despite the best efforts of the Border Patrol, is going to depress working class wages.
By the way, on that point, so I can't remember if it was last week, a couple weeks ago, whatever, and we were talking about the cui bono. You know, who benefits from this mass influx of illegal immigration? What I didn't realize at the time, and I'm assuming you didn't either, was that these people, what the system, how the system is set up right now, and has been for a while, These people come in, they ask for asylum. Okay, here's your court date. Uh, 2035, you got to show up at some point. In the meantime, here are your work papers. You can go legally work now. So, because one of the puzzlements that we had was, well, who's hiring them if you're not allowed to hire illegal immigrants? Now, you and I both know that lots of illegal immigrants get hired on the side. But if you have work papers, then you can legally be hired. And I don't know if minimum wage laws or any other laws cover you. You may be a seasonal employee. Seasonal employees do not have the same wage scale as a full-time or a part-time employee. They don't have the same benefits requirements or anything else. So I that sort of scheme makes it, I think, a little bit more understandable, the cui bono, who want these illegal immigrants to come in, get their legal work permits, and then everything's hunky-dory.
Well, clearly
that drives down the wages.
Clearly it's employers, because obviously it drives down their wages,
their costs.
That's their cost of employment. So, if you're worried about, prices and everything else, well, part and parcel of that worry is the fact that you're not going to get the raises that you might normally expect.
That's right.
When you have so many new entrants into the labor market, it's simply going to depress your wages. I mean, even if we assume that all of these migrants who are coming in are fine, upstanding, the traditional libertarian idea of immigration. These people are just, fungible economic
champions of liberty.
Yeah, fungible economic units who can replace us one to one with no other possible cultural or societal effects. Okay, but even if that's true, you're still arguing that you are perfectly happy with seeing working class wages depressed.
Right.
Even if we assume that there were no other problems attendant with unrestricted immigration at all, it would still drive down wages.
And I think that's what those top three lines there, I think that's what kind of wraps them all up in a bow, is it may not be an explicit understanding, but I think it's an understanding, an empirical understanding of what's actually going on around you.
And how much money they can expect to make next year or the year
Right.
after next compared to this year. Yeah. Okay, so horse race stuff. I don't think we need to get too deep into this, but Donald Trump just appears to be running away with it. Looking at him in comparison with Mike Pence or Tim Scott or Nikki Haley, I guess Ron DeSantis is the only guy on this chart who breaks 30% against Trump. And again, we haven't even started primaries. We don't actually know how any of this is going to go.
It's way too early.
Yeah, but a vast majority, 57%, don't even think Ron DeSantis is going to be a viable challenge to Trump. Who cares what voters feel about abortion in terms of Florida's law? Joe Biden appears to be the guy who everybody thinks is going to make it. People are split over whether they think Trump will win the GOP nomination. It's really hard to square this belief with this chart.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if this is what you think, then that 52% number should be a lot larger. But people, at least at the moment, think that Donald Trump has a lock. Joe Biden, in fact, Trump is at 52%.
Right,
Donald Trump
yeah.
will win or lose the Republican primary. Joe Biden, 50%, win or lose, which I think is very interesting, unless the idea
Especially as an incumbent.
especially as an incumbent, but also, an 80-year-old incumbent who may or may not make it. So in a hypothetical matchup between Trump and Biden and Trump and Harris, Trump comes out at 47%, Biden at 40%. So Trump plus 7 with, 13% undecided. 50% Trump against 39% Harris. So 11 ahead of Harris in a race like that. I don't know that that's true. Um,
Well, it might be true now, but
yeah, it might be true now. I don't know that that is
I'm
true.
not sure that's a lasting
Yeah,
thing.
a year from now. DeSantis, on the other hand, runs head to head, 42% to 42%. Again, who knows about DeSantis? He hasn't run, so we can treat that with a grain of salt. And then there's stuff about Nikki Haley. Um, this is interesting, though. And both parties, as far as I can tell at the moment, are running headlong against this. 62% of the voters say Biden shouldn't run for a second term. 54% say that Trump should not run for a second term. In both cases, there are significant majorities who do not want either Biden or Trump to run for a second term. And that is even more emphasized
Pronounced.
by
Yeah.
this question here, where 66% thinks that Trump versus Biden again is not the choice we want to make. Now, this is really interesting
I
because,
would be included in that 66%.
yeah, I'd be included in that 66% as well. And this is really interesting. And this is one of the first big disconnections between our political class and what the American people seem to want, or what the electorate seems to want. What the electorate seems to want is Emirads on both of these guys' houses and to have completely different choices. By, 66%. That's a substantial majority.
Yeah.
We just don't want another Biden Trump election. We just don't.
Because we don't want either one of them.
Yeah, that's what it all comes down to. The majority of this country doesn't want either of these two guys to be president. And our political system is, at least from the way it appears now, and again, we haven't even started the primaries. We don't know how any of this is really going to go, especially given what Donald Trump has been doing over the past week in his attacks on Ron DeSantis, which perhaps we'll talk about a little later. But we're having this at the moment. We're having this. This is the race that's being shoved down our throats,
Yeah.
and it's the race that nobody wants.
Right.
This is the
Well, except the media.
Yeah, except the media. And this is the first indication of some serious dichotomies between what the political class wants us to believe and what the American people actually believe. Would Biden serve a full term? I can't believe that there are 39% that believe a reelected Biden would serve a full term. Is Joe Biden mentally fit? 57% have doubts about his fitness. 65% think he's too old to be president. And yet, that appears to be what they are going to be sending after us. I have some demographics about who's looking at what. It's interesting. Republicans, they watch Fox News. Democrats watch CNN. I'm shocked to learn this bit of demographic data. All
I
right.
mentioned those other numbers. If you go back a slide, how big those other numbers are. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, where people are getting their news from. They're
Yeah.
getting it from someplace other than the mainstream media for reasons that will be obvious shortly. So, 50% of the electorate doesn't know anything about the Durham report.
Yeah, of course not.
Not a thing. And, 50-50 on whether it was a fair or biased investigation. So it's really weird because this is one of the most important investigations that shows clear misconduct and malfeasance in office by FBI officials. And we're at 50-50%.
I mean, I would say actionable treasonous activity, quite frankly.
Yeah. And yet, half the country doesn't know anything about it. I can only presume this is the half of the country who is watching the mainstream
this makes
media.
Watergate look like who stuck the chewing gum under the school desk kind of level of offense. This stuff is so far beyond the pale, using the arms of government to manipulate not only a presidency but an election. 2 elections. Well, 3 elections, if you really want to go
Yeah,
into it.
and they're going to get away with it too.
Of course they will.
Nobody's ever going to go to jail. The one guy that lost his job, Andrew McCabe, got to keep his pension. Yeah.
Well, and even Andrew Kleinsmith. I think he lost his bar license for a time. I don't know that he was fully disbarred. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And yet 55% of the voters say there was nothing new here. And you know what? They're right. There was nothing new. We all knew.
I would be in that 55% because I've known this stuff for so long. It's simply been, okay, what I already thought and had seen lots of evidence for has now been proven.
And yet half of the electorate still believes that, well, it's not actually half of the electorate. This is where we live in two completely different countries. Was the investigation into Donald Trump for his Russia ties, was that well-founded or not, or unfounded? Unfounded, 68% of the GOP, but 72% of Democrats say that that was a well-founded investigation.
Only 68% of Republicans.
Yeah, I would have thought that would be higher. But 72% of Democrats.
What about independents?
That investigation, independents, 56% say it was unfounded.
I mean, that kind of puts the lie to the. And again, everybody knows what happened. I mean, we can all pretend that we don't know, but everybody knows what happened. This was so obviously a coup, an attempted coup.
Yeah, look,
by the agents, government arms and the media.
The agents on the ground said this is all a bunch of bullshit.
Right.
And FBI headquarters said, no, you're going to open an investigation anyway.
Anyway, right. We don't have any evidence. Oh, you're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Well, but like this whole thing, I don't think we can get a FISA on this. You're going to get the FISA.
And they did.
And kept it going for nearly a year.
But 72% of Democrats, even after the Durham report, now, granted, half of them don't even know what's in the Durham report, so still 72% saying this was a perfectly well-founded investigation. We live in two different countries.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I could come forward with a J'accuse article, a la the Dreyfus affair, and it would run in an exactly maybe 10 papers throughout the nation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an investment in this fantasy that government is benign, that everything's just fine. There's just lots of extremists on the right and the left. Things are going to just work out fine if we just keep muddling along. It's just not true. It's not true. And it can't be true because all that muddling along has simply left our entire populace being deviated slowly to the left. It doesn't feel like we're doing much, but yeah, we're going a little bit more left. And then we're going kind of really left. And like, wasn't the path over there? No, this is the right path. We're good. We're just going to keep going this way to the point where now men are women, women are men. Like,
yeah, the Overton window only moves,
sexual beings.
The Overton window only moves one way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, reality itself is now so incredibly distorted that you can be fired, arrested for simply saying that things are real. I mean, we're living on like Galilean times. I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, it's beyond Orwellian. We have regressed over 1,000 years.
But here again, it's not we. Look at the difference between
Well, okay, yeah, fine.
these two numbers. It really is two different countries who want to live in two different factual universes. Now, that's not
Right.
true. One of these universes is factually incorrect, but we don't care because we prefer that universe over the universe of uncomfortable facts that conflict with our preferred views.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you have to, upon pain of death, uh, losing your job, being forced into poverty, uh, you have to also agree with us that these views are the only valid views. You must reject all of your. Uh,
You must. Do you reject Satan and all of his works?
I mean, lest you become a heretic to the leftist way of thinking, you can't say this stuff in public anymore. I mean, you look at that poor woman, that nurse. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but the way it was framed, that nurse in was in New York, I think. I think it was in New York. Trying to take a bike home. She's 6 months pregnant. Bunch of guys like go and try to take her bike from. It was one of those pay
Yeah.
as you go bikes.
Yeah, it was a city bike. She bought the city bike. Apparently, she has the receipts for it, which she gave to her attorney. It was her bike.
Right.
And then,
And then this, it gets videoed, and she immediately gets lambasted. And my favorite thing about this
and
is
placed
that
on leave from her job.
got placed on leave. Actually, yeah, I think it's even worse than that. I think she was actually let go. She was placed on leave and then let go, or something like that. Gets just libeled all across Twitter and the media and the newspapers. Absolutely appalling. And it turns out not only was she in the right, I don't know how they consider her white. Like, is she really white? I mean, I guess she's Hispanic. Is this one of those white Hispanics?
Yes, like what's his name, George.
George, yeah.
George, what's his name in Florida? Well, he's a white Hispanic.
Right. So that's, no. So you know what I mean?
Anyway, back to this. The Durham thing. A majority of the voters think that the FBI prioritized Trump over Democrats. They also think that the media is ducking and covering it because they don't like the
outcome.
The outcome of it. Do you think Donald Trump worked in concert with Russia? 56% think it was false. Steele dossier, true
Only
or false?
56%.
56% think it was false. Half of the country believes something, the other half of the country doesn't. However, 70% of the voters are not surprised that the FBI violated its own standards in starting the Trump-Russia probe. Half of the voters believe that
Right.
it is perfectly reasonable to think that the FBI violated its own standards.
Well, was this an actual poll of voters?
Yes. 2,000
Of
registered
voters.
voters, yes.
Wow. So that's the Antifa voters in that extra percentage of red, because of course they think you're like, oh yeah, absolutely, the FBI screwed people over. That's the 20% that's keeping Robert Kennedy Jr. Afloat in the Democratic primary.
Yeah, I'm sure that it is. But again, no one is surprised. And from here on in, we're going to start talking a little bit more about institutions and seeing what people feel about institutions. And this is the first shot across the bow. What this tells me is that the electorate, at least this portion of it, believes that the FBI can't be trusted, that the FBI will violate
Good.
its own standards to accomplish whatever its purposes are. So no trust in that institution. Are we concerned about the FBI? well, 37% very concerned, 33%
70, yeah,
somewhat concerned.
71% total.
Yeah, 70. Oh, and 71%. Do we need wide-ranging reform to prevent? Yes, 71% believes that we do need a wide-ranging. So, it's really interesting. Compare and contrast
Right. Yeah.
that with that.
But that just exhibits a tribal society, right? I mean, well, and the main theme that you kind of brought up at the beginning, that we're living in two different realities. And yet there are some realities that we can both recognize at the same time.
Yeah, so I trust the FBI with Donald Trump, but I distrust them in everything else.
Right.
Because that's exactly what at least 30-ish% of the voters or 20-ish% of the voters are saying. Yeah. I don't think the FBI can be trusted, but I trust them with this Donald Trump.
Yeah, but this one's okay because obviously he's corrupt.
yeah, clearly he's a bad guy, so the FBI was right to do this. But in any other circumstance, I don't trust the FBI.
If we went back to the 90s and it was Bill Clinton that was in this, I mean, you would have gotten, a similar thing, Republicans versus Democrats, right?
Yeah, well, it's been that way for a long time, although I think it was probably more 50-50 under Bill Clinton than it is right now. However, let's look at Democrats. 60% of them believe that the Hunter Biden laptop is real.
Really?
60%
of the Democrats?
Of Democrats believe that it's real.
Wow, that's impressive. That gives me hope.
So 59%, now it's 79% for the GOP. So there is still
who are the 11% or the 21% who don't believe it's real? How are they GOP? Oh, no.
It doesn't make any sense, but it's interesting. 60% of Democrats believe the Hunter Biden laptop is real. So, do we believe that the FBI is fully investigating this? 66% of Democrats say yes, they are.
Oh, of course.
Compared to 73% of Republicans that say they're not, and 60% of independents who say that they're not. So, majority of the people don't think the FBI is fully investigating these issues. This stuff is all over the map, and it really is interesting to go through this. I mean, for me, maybe people who are watching think this is just all.
So I always think that it's the independent. Obviously, independence. So I always describe myself as independent, right? Because I'm not even registered with any party. I have the benefit of doing that in Virginia, where I don't have to register with a party. I don't want to be registered to a party. So I'm always interested in what the independents, how they're leaning, because although they're not necessarily obviously I'm not that independent. I'm going to lean towards GOP on most things, almost everything nowadays. It only is my best alternative. But I'll never join the GOP. So I'm kind of one of those Republican-leaning GOPs or independents, and there are lots of Dem-leaning independents as well. So it's interesting to see those numbers, especially when they line up with one or the other, and they invariably do. They're never going to be as different inter-category as the like Dem or GOP ones are, but they will mirror one or the other just to a lesser extent. And so when you see the GOP and independents lining up together, you can kind of get a good indication that a good majority of people are not buying the Dem spin. And just the opposite is true. When independents and Democrats are pretty close in those numbers, you get a pretty good idea that the GOP spend is just losing.
Yeah, well, in this case, 65% of independents and 83% of the GOP believes that Hunter Biden was involved in influence peddling.
Well, I mean, yeah. thank God that there's there's that many cogent people that can look at actual evidence and say, "Oh yeah, that's real."
Yeah, and by the way,
The fact that
53%.
there's even a question about this is fucking ridiculous. He clearly was influenced badly. What did he ever sell? Was he like making like, finger paintings for China?
He had no products. There's nothing to sell. The only thing that he could sell was access to his dad. And
Maybe he had a really good Coke connection that he was selling to Burisma. I have no idea, but
and by the way, 53% think that Joe Biden was involved in it.
yeah, of course.
Although 75% of Democrats still say,
Oh,
"Oh, Joe Biden wasn't involved."
well, we didn't see his name in any of those things.
Yeah, because there was no
10% for the big
line.
guy?
Yeah, there was no line item in their accounting that said illegal bribe payment to Joe, so therefore it must never have happened. So here's what we were originally talking about when it comes to the debt ceiling. 65% do not believe that Joe Biden is willing to curb any spending at all. Indeed, 56% of Democrats believe that as well. Should Congress have conditions on raising the debt ceiling? 60% of the electorate believes that they should.
Yeah, that's completely different than the way the media reports it, right?
Yeah, exactly. This disconnect between what we're getting from the political class and certainly from the Democrats, even the Democrats' own voters, now it's very close. 54% raised the debt ceiling without conditions, but 46%, even among Democrats, is a sizable plurality to
That's
say,
pretty
"Hey,
huge, yeah.
we have to have
Especially
constraints."
given like whatever the margins of error are here.
Yeah, and
Uh,
especially given the fact that 73% of the GOP and 64% of independents also say there needs to be conditions. People are concerned about the level of debt.
and going back to that chart that showed the top three things are all economic.
Yep.
So yeah, this is, and you know what? What's interesting is, despite the disconnect between the media complex and the Democrats, um, there are enough people that are really empirically feeling this crunch that they would respond this way, because this isn't a news awareness thing. This is yeah, things are really sucking right now. It's getting harder and harder to buy stuff. It's getting harder and harder to plan for the future. It's getting harder and harder to maintain what I already have. These are stressing things. And I don't know how much longer I can, when my wage growth is, stagnating and everything else is starting to cost more. I just feel like I'm getting further and further behind. And that's becoming a depressingly common thing amongst a lot of Americans, whatever their political affiliation. I mean, people respond pretty damn quickly to reality. Politicians, not so much.
And here's the other thing. People know intrinsically, look, if I make 50,000 a year and I spend 65,000 a year, okay, I can run 15,000 on my credit card for, a year. But ultimately, I'm going to have to pay that back. And
Right.
ultimately, I can't keep spending
And
65,000
ultimately,
a
they're
year.
not going to give me any more credit.
Yeah, and they may not understand how government finance works. And they may not understand that governments can issue sovereign debt. And they may not understand modern monetary theory, but everybody has the common sense idea that we can't just keep borrowing money forever. I don't know what
Right.
the bad thing that will happen if the government keeps borrowing money forever. And the bad thing hasn't happened yet, but I can't imagine it wouldn't be awful whenever the bill finally comes due, and the bill always comes due.
Well, and you have to understand too that a lot of these people have probably at one point, I'm not going to say the majority, but a significant minority have felt those consequences. They've experienced that. They've either been through bankruptcy, they've gotten tossed out of their house, they've lost a vehicle, they've lost businesses. People have seen what happens when your debt outweighs your income. And when they see the federal government doing it with just reckless abandon and they keep getting screwed over, there's not a lot of dots that need to be connected there. You know?
Yeah, you don't have to know a lot about government finance to think this is a pretty bad idea.
Right.
And the fact that there are such substantial majorities who think that what is going on right now with the debt is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And yet, and look, Republicans have let's not talk about the Biden deficit and debt without talking about the Trump deficit and debt. Let's not
Okay, fine. Let's talk about them both.
Yeah, let's not pretend that the Donald Trump era was some era of financial rectitude.
It absolutely was not.
And people know that as well. They know that both parties, when given the chance in power, we've seen it under Trump now, and look, we've seen it ever since George H.W.
We made a big deal about that too when Trump was doing that. We're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, and by the way,
remember when he came out and he was like, I can't believe I'm going to sign this bill. Don't you ever send me but I'm going to sign it, but don't you ever send me a bill. It's like, what the hell was that? This is like,
at least
your kid comes to you.
At least not until next year.
Right. Oh, that was such bullshit.
Yeah, and people can see it going on with both parties. People know that our political class is so disconnected from any sort of financial restraint when it comes to government spending. And
they also see and suspect even more that the political class benefits greatly on a personal level from all this spending. And that's absolutely true. They do.
Sure. And yet, these same 65% or 60% who think this whole debt thing is really bad will vote to elect the same congressman that they've elected for the past 5 terms to Washington, D.C.
But it's not my congressman.
Most voters,
other congresspeople.
Yeah, most voters, 63%, think the Democrats should negotiate on the debt ceiling. 62% think the Republicans should hold out for spending constraints.
And yet, well, I don't know. I have a hard time thinking that Slow Joe is not going to blink. He talks tough, but he never acts tough. He doesn't have the balls. And I think he's going to cave. Kevin McCarthy, I got to be honest, was not thrilled about him getting the speakership. But I think he has earned the trust that he promised in doing what he's done. He has been very steadfast in holding the Biden administration's feet to the fire. I don't think he's betrayed anybody's principles, and I think he's been quite adamant about pushing the right agenda.
Yeah, he's been
impressed.
He's been surprisingly pushy. He's not what I
I thought he was going to be another Paul Ryan or
yeah. Well, more of a squish from the Republican people.
And he's been, and you know what? I really appreciate the fact that he's not like Newt Gingrich was a firebrand, but he also had quite a cohort behind him in Congress at the time. McCarthy is governing a rather fragile coalition, and he's doing a damned good job.
And a very tiny majority, by the way.
A very tiny majority, but he's still enacting the will of the Republicans, and they're standing behind him. I mean, he's clearly a good leader. I give him applause because I really did not think he was going to be the man to do it.
Yeah, well, and apparently he
man
is,
or a woman.
Apparently,
right.
He's winning in the public, the arena of public opinion, Anyway,
which is even better because that's exactly what the speaker needs to be. That's why he's called the fucking speaker. You need to be out there expressing the will of the people.
and by the way,
And
47% of Democrats say the Democrats should be the ones who cave on this debt
yeah,
ceiling negotiation.
well, and yeah, again, it goes back to, hey, look, I'm all for these stupid fights over abortion and whatever, but hey, my pocketbook, yeah, let's
Yeah,
let's ease up, Jack.
yeah, people do get a lot more unified there. Would spending cuts help or hurt the health of the government? 62% help. Spending limits help or hurt? 65% help. So people want some financial change, which we're not getting in Washington, D.C. All right,
Well,
51.
especially after the last, well, I guess 3 years, with the incredible ramp up of public spending. I think that was just so much that it just can't escape public notice. You know, it's one thing to add an extra half a billion, maybe or half a billion, half a trillion, a trillion, you know, eventually. And it's like, well, oh, I guess we only spent, you know, when you ramp up 2 trillion, uh, you know, basically 50% more than what our normal budget is,
Yeah, it
uh,
just gets insane after a while.
it,
I mean,
it
people
gets really
realize,
noticeable.
yeah, people realize that it's a problem. The other thing people are realizing is a problem. 51% say that illegal immigration is a serious issue.
This is such an obvious issue. And, you know, you talked at the beginning about the disconnect between the media and regular people.
And this is one of those areas where it's a big disconnect because we are routinely lectured by the media class how, this is a nation of immigrants and we should all be very welcoming and very accepting to these people who just want to come here and build a better life for their family, which, by the way, I assume is largely true. They just do want to come here and build a better life for their family.
Okay, go to Italy.
But it's
Go to
not,
Argentina, go to Brazil. Go somewhere else.
yeah, it's not our responsibility to just allow anybody to come in here willy-nilly. We do get to choose who comes and who doesn't come. The
Right.
idea that we can just run anyone across the border who wants, and by the way,
As a matter of fact, is there any other nation in the entire world that allows this sort
no,
of thing?
not
Canada doesn't.
not really. All of the Europeans are, having these same
Yeah.
discussions right now. Uh, I mean, the
They
difference.
have nothing like the amount of immigration that we have, though.
No,
Illegal immigration.
they don't. But 51% say it's very serious. 28% say somewhat serious. You put those two together, and you're at 80%.
Yeah. And
So,
it's getting noticeable. It's one thing when it's the border states. It's another thing when people in New York, Illinois, California. Well, California, yeah, right. Like that changes anything.
yeah. But I mean, look, when you are like Secretary Mayorkas, who can come out and say, "Hey, we got the border under control. Everything is fine." Clearly, people don't believe you.
Right. Well, because he's lying.
Yeah.
He's absolutely lying.
If people believed him, half of the electorate, slightly more than half of the electorate, wouldn't regard it as a very serious problem.
And as a matter of fact, like I brought up earlier when we were going back to that QE Bono thing, this is how the Biden administration defines that we've reduced illegal immigration. Because they give them free work permits if they claim asylum. Well, they came in and they did the system. Wait, but that's not what our law says. That's what your stupid interpretation of regulations says. And all you do is then you let them into the country, you give them work permits, you give them a court date out, 10, 15 years. And then in 10, 15 years, people are going to be like, oh, but they've been here. They grow up here. They have children here. They made their whole lives here. You can't just kick them out.
Yeah,
I
but
mean, this is rinse, repeat.
yeah.
They just do it every time.
And here's the thing: if you have these two lines, very serious and somewhat serious, who think immigration is a real bad problem, Then you go to the very next slide, and a majority support repealing Title 42.
I don't have a problem with repealing Title 42. What I have a problem with is not why weren't we also doing Title 8? Why aren't we doing the entire immigration law and stopping these people at the border? I mean, Title 42 was great, but we had lots, and we still have lots of other laws in place that say get to come in here without the right papers. I don't know how much more simple to make this.
Yeah, well, we have the laws. What we don't have are people who are willing
we don't have enforcement
to
and
enforce them.
These poor CB people. So not the last time, but the time before I was in San Diego, I think I told you about this. I don't know on the podcast or just personally, but the hotel I was staying in, I was hanging out with some CBP people, CBP people, and they were down there on special assignment. My wife, because she always stays at the hotel, also hung out with some of them, and they're down there for months at a time, and they're really there not to protect the border. They're there to do administrative bullshit. Check people in, give them court dates, take some bullshit address and name with no proof of anything, process them through, and get them into the country. And they're telling me,
and that's exactly what they're doing.
Me, yeah, we know this is all bullshit, but they bring us down here to do that. Now they're also charged with altercation happens. They're the ones in charge of stopping that and calming that down. But they say most of the time they go on like 6-month assignments, and they're just there to do bullshit, absolute bullshit. Just let these people in.
Yeah, because it's all catch and release.
Yeah, absolutely.
Largely. So over 2.75 million people came to the United States illegally.
We know of
from September 21 to September 22. More than
Are we still clinging to that idea that there was only 11 million illegals in the country, which I think that was the number back in like 1998 and also 2004 and also in 2009.
68% have looked at those numbers and said, we have to reduce the flow of people coming across the border.
Yeah. Since the real number is probably closer to 30 or 40 million.
However, with that, 68% saying we need new, stricter policies, 53% say, well, Joe Biden is just trying to enforce immigration laws more humanely.
What?
These two charts...
How is it more humane?
These two charts don't make sense when put next to each other. They don't make any
sense.
So there is a real disconnect there.
The only thing I can think of there is they don't cry about cages anymore, right? So,
well, that's true.
I mean, that's if you're talking about humanitarian, so that's a caring thing, right?
Yeah. So that's
when was the last time we heard about kids in cages? When was the last time we heard about kids being completely lost, about child trafficking? You don't hear about that in the mainstream media.
No.
Legacy media.
53% of the electorate thinks that the border policies are increasing the flow of drugs and crime to the United States. Okay, again, compare that to that. It's some weird dichotomies. However, do people who cross the border with Mexico illegally, should they be turned back to Mexico or released into the U.S. with a court date? Well, 68% say returned to Mexico.
This is the only thing that gives me hope for America.
Yeah, except 54% are perfectly or 46% are perfectly opposed to forcing those back to Mexico to wait for a court date under Title 42. So, again, it doesn't. Some of these results don't make sense. I mean, they're not even internally consistent. I don't know if this is a case of a lot of what
This
are they?
may be a case of just not understanding what the question is that's being asked.
Maybe, but 68% say if you come over here illegally, you should be returned back to
See,
Mexico.
that's like a straightforward question. When you ask something about Title 42, maybe people are thinking,
Yeah,
"Oh,
how much?
Title 42. I heard something bad about that." No, no, no. I'm no on the 42.
Yeah, I just know that I want them sent back to Mexico.
Does Title 42 that? I don't know.
Yes, actually, it does.
No,
Well, it's supposed to, but in any event,
I was
67% of Americans think crime is increasing. 56% think that the justice system has systemic racism. By the way, it's 69% of Democrats who think it has systemic racism.
I would love is if somebody could show me a falsifiable definition of systemic racism.
Systemic racism? Yeah, well,
I've seen
don't hold your
plenty
breath.
of non-falsifiable definitions. I've never seen a falsifiable definition of systemic racism, and I'm willing to be schooled on this. If anybody has an example, please drop it in the comments. I would love to actually see that. I want to see something that says to me that given X plus Y and then C, that's structural racism. Okay, I will give that consideration. Absolutely. I don't like racism. I certainly don't want structural racism. I don't want any racism. So if you can give me that formula, I will love it.
But the
What
preferred
I've never seen is a non-false. What I've only seen is a non-falsifiable description of systemic racism. Well, it's systemic racism because I said it's racism. Oh, so Ipsy Dixit is how it works now.
Now, here's an interesting one, though. Do you think the solution for racism is to make the justice system more colorblind or give it preferences based on race? 70% of Democrats, 76% of the GOP, 73% of independents all say to make the justice system colorblind.
Which is exactly what BLM is against, isn't it?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, but that has large majorities across the board. Make it colorblind.
Because that's exactly what it should be. It should be colorblind.
Yeah, but
It
then
shouldn't have anything to do with color.
But then you get into the next question about the inner city district attorneys in New York and Philadelphia. Well, 52% says they're just creating a fairer, just system. Interesting enough, however, 61% of the GOP, 56% of independents say they're just letting criminals go unpunished.
I'm surprised the numbers are that fucking low, quite
But
frankly.
but it is the number of Democrats who, I mean, that's the real
Push
dichotomy.
it over the majority edge.
Yeah, that's where it pushes it over the edge. Should defendants be treated more leniently? Nope. How about racial preferences in college admission? Nope. 77% and 74%.
Which is interesting because that's before the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah, but there's clearly the plurality here is for a colorblind system and to not include race
and
at all.
So the lessons that you and I learned back in the 70s and me, in the 80s
And 80s, yeah.
Was that, the whole idea of prejudice and the whole idea where the first ideas of phobia came up were because, well, you're just afraid of the other. Get to know these people. And so that's what literally millions of us did. And we're like, yeah, no, they're just like us. They might talk a little different. They might act a little different, but Yeah, we have the same interests. We have fun doing the same things. Blah blah blah. Okay, so we blew up. We blew up. We grew up pretty colorblind, only to get to the 2010s to learn that, oh no, colorblind. That's just racist.
Well,
What?
here's the weird thing, because I was born in 1964, so I don't remember a world prior to well, clearly the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or quite frankly, I had not reached political consciousness for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I lived in a country where it
But the
was.
next year you're down on that
Yeah, the
shit.
next year though, I really was studying up on it. So I was raised in a country that was all about, okay, all the color blindness. We're not going to take race into account in anything. And I grew up learning about segregation, about people like Orville Faubus and Lester Maddox and
Right.
George Wallace. Segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation forever. And how all of that was horrible.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2022, and it is, oh, yes, we want to have racially segregated graduation ceremonies now.
Racially segregated dorms, racially segregated work.
Yeah, I was told all that was bad.
Right. Like this is totally confusing for people that come up, born in the 60s and went through all that like struggle and we're like, okay, yeah, no, we get it.
I mean,
We don't want to treat anybody different.
people had fire hoses sprayed at them and German
Right.
shepherds released on them for saying, hey, we don't want to be segregated anymore.
Right.
And 2 generations later, well, maybe Lester Maddox had the right idea. No, no, he didn't.
Absolutely asinine.
Yeah, we're recycling the same arguments, except this time it's the shoes on the other foot.
The first time it actually came from an American perspective that everybody has the right to essential freedoms. That's why it worked so well. That's why it was so easy to sell. That's why people bought into it. You and I were raised the same way.
And look, by the way, bought into it pretty hard.
Yeah, very hard. To the point where we bent over backwards to say, you know what? Okay, fine. We're going to give you a little leg up. We bought into that hard. We said, you're right. We do want to be as equal as possible here. I'm not judging you based on your skin or whatever your ethnicity. That's out the window. Everybody gets, the same, first pass to engagement.
Which,
And
by
then
the
all of
way,
a sudden it gets changed, and now it's like,
yeah,
oh no, no, no.
but people still support the elimination of racial preferences.
It speaks to the lasting and fundamental fairness of the American ideal. And I don't think it's unique to America. I think we express it the most, but I think lots and lots and lots of other people throughout the world feel this fundamentally. But we express it here, and we really, really doggedly stick to it, and we'll follow through on it. That everybody should be treated fairly.
But
I
the
don't care if
interesting,
you're
the interesting,
trans, gay, black, whatever.
but the interesting,
Everybody should get the same opportunity.
yeah, but the interesting thing about that is that the people who make the hiring decisions or the people who make admissions decisions, they don't believe this. They fall
No.
into that little slice of blue.
That's right.
The people who are in charge, the people who make the people who run our institutions are in full voice support of this, despite the fact that they are a tiny minority of the country. Clearly, the culture has not moved significantly in that direction.
Unfortunately, that's right.
In fact,
There
in
are
my
still
lifetime,
people.
in my lifetime, the country has moved completely away from that. Because if you'd have asked this question in Georgia, for example, in 1956, you would have gotten far different answers.
Uh, would you? I think you would have gotten pretty similar answers to now.
Well, but their racial preferences would have been for white people to get in,
Sure,
not to allow
but
black people to get in.
maybe the categories were switched, but they would have been remarkably similar. I think post 1965, after the two civil rights acts, and generally a cooling of, um, well, maybe a venting of the spleen and then a cooling of those things and an expansion of the economy, people were like, you know, we can just get along just fine. We're, I don't really care what color you are or what religion you are. We're cool, right? Like we like hanging out. Okay, cool. Then we'll just do that. And that was really my experience growing up. I mean, that's how it was. And I didn't care. I didn't know anybody else who cared. I'll never forget the first time I encountered real racism. Uh, I was a, actually I was a graduated senior from high school, so this has been the summer of '86, and kid I knew from high school. I always thought was just a super nice kid, nice guy. Played for the football team. He was kind of a small kid, but he was just a nice guy. And I'm standing in line. We're all at the local. It's called the Charcoal Pit in Wilmington, Delaware, and we're all standing in line, just waiting to get a table and get some ice cream and some burgers and whatever. And he's a couple feet behind me, and he looks over at the kitchen, and I can hear him. I don't think he even knows I'm there. And he says, "They have making beef patties here." I turned around, I was like, "What? What did he just say?" Like I never heard anybody say anything like that ever in my life. I was absolutely floored. And come from that kid, who I thought was just like the nicest guy. So like this was completely not the norm when I grew up. That you would say something like that and not expect to like be like, "What the fuck are you saying?"
When I was in fifth grade, I believe it was, I was raised in a little town in East Texas, just outside of Houston, named Sheldon. And when I was in fifth grade, they called a student assembly, a school-wide student assembly, into the gym at C.E. King Junior High School. I say fifth grade. It wouldn't have been fifth grade. It would have been sixth grade because I was in junior high. And so we all went in there and we all sat down, and our principal, whose last name was Mr. Null. I don't remember his first name now, but Mr. Null came out after the entire student body had gathered in the gym, and he came out and he announced that the next day there would be 3 black students attending our school. And he wanted to hold a assembly to let us all know that it would not be acceptable to say anything racial to these students, to be mean to these students, to start any problems, to get into any fights, that they would be monitoring us very carefully.
This was like 1969, 1970.
I was in sixth grade. So let's see, 70, it was when I was in first grade, when I was 6, right? So this would be 1976. Right, yeah, 1976, 1977. The 76-77 school year. And I can remember looking over at my 2 friends, Chris Kratz and Sandy White. Sandy was Jewish, by the way. And looking over with these quizzical expressions on our face. Why would we
Right.
do anything to the black kids that came here? Looking back on it now, I realize this was a bunch of adults who had been raised in segregation era Texas.
Exactly. Yeah. They're projecting their own times onto you.
Right. So, from, most of them were born in right after World War II, right? So, I mean, these are all adults who were born from, 46 to 50. And here they were, between 27 and 35 years of age now, and having, from 1946 to 1964, their entire school life. Well, of course, schools were regulated or segregated. Of course, there were blacks only drinking fountains. I mean, this was East Texas.
Right.
And so the idea that into our little, what was basically, look, it's just a bunch of rednecks in East Texas, right? I mean, it was basically just a white community of poor rednecks. And these three black people were going to come in. And of course, all of the adults remembered the 1950s and the 1960s, stuff that none of us really remembered. I mean,
cared about.
Or cared about. I mean, look, the race riots in 1968, I was 4 years old. I knew nothing about that.
Well, especially since, like, I bet you've been playing, hoops and, like, stickball and chasing people around, cops and robbers with other black kids.
No, there were no black kids in our community.
You had no black kids in your
community? No, we were a solid white community. This was the year that the very first black children moved into Sheldon, Texas.
Oh, wow. See, I can't remember. I don't think I have lived where there weren't other races.
No, we were a completely white community. Every single student in the two elementary schools, we had a junior high and a high school. So every student in that school district was white. There were no black families. There were no black children. So no, I didn't play with any black children when I was growing up. They just weren't there. I mean, I don't know that I noticed it as a, freaking 9, 10, 11-year-old.
How would you notice it?
And so when they said, hey, black kids are coming to school, we all just looked at each other and said, okay, so I guess there's going to be black kids at school tomorrow. And so the whole thing about saying, oh, don't you cause any trouble, for most of us, it was just, why would we cause trouble?
Yeah, why is that a problem? We don't even get the connection.
Yeah, we didn't even get the connection. And yet for all of those adults who had been raised in segregation Texas, this was like a super major thing. And I think what really irks me about that is looking at this particular thing, where 40% of the people think that white supremacy is the biggest threat to the country. I just don't think that's true. I don't think there's any possible way in which you can argue that white supremacy today in 2022 is in any way comparable to the white supremacy that existed in the 1940s or prior to
the
the 1960s.
Citizen councils and
and
I mean,
legally,
if Bruce was here, that's what he would bring up immediately.
And legal segregation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like I said, if Bruce was here, that's the first thing he would bring up with, the good citizen councils, the absolutely government enforced legal segregation.
I mean, this was segregation actually enforced by the government. Don't tell me that 200 Patriot Front marchers, all of whom are in very good shape, marching in Washington,
very
D.C.
similar tastes and style.
Yeah. Don't tell me that that's a threat to a country that had legally imposed segregation for 70 years since Plessy versus Ferguson. So that would be 1896 to 1964. Don't tell me that white supremacy was less of a threat then than it is now. And yet it is basically the Democrats who are the ones who say that 61% say it is it's the greatest threat to the country. I just don't. The dichotomy between the two is just really amazing to me. And then finally, China and industrial policy.
We're not going into this.
Yeah, we're not tough enough on China. We're too lenient on China. Yeah, I believe so.
It's 9:40.
Okay. We should ban TikTok. And we like the buy. Here's the last thing. We like the Buy America thing. We want to have stuff made.
It's becoming more popular.
Yeah. What we don't want to do is to have automobile pollution limits on vehicles. But we do like
good.
but we do like the Buy America. So anyway, I just thought it was an interesting poll that came out this week, and I did want to.
It's actually, there's a lot of soup to mine there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that would provide a lot of conversation.
Peas, carrots, onions, might even be some capers.
However, not conversation for tonight because it is 6:44 my time and 3 hours later your time. So, having said that, we'll just say good night, Michael, and we'll talk to you again. Talk to you again next week.
All right, brother.
All right. You've been listening to, well, not only listening, I guess you've been watching the podcast for Sunday, the 21st of May. I have not grabbed a song for the outro, so I'm going to grab something at random. I have no idea what this music is going to be. I hope it's not awful because I am going to play it, and it is going to be our outro music. Yeah, it's awful. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, have a great week. So long.